We have some students with mics who are more than happy to hand them to you if you would like to ask a question of our panelists. And I suggest we just continue the discussion. Up there, yes. And introduce yourself, please.
Yes, my name is Brig Williams. I'm also from physics. This may be tangentially related, but I've heard it's very important, and that is, I've read that there's an ecological time bomb having to do with the thawing of Siberia. And I wonder whether anybody here could comment on that.
Sounds to me directly related. Is there an expert in the house on the thawing of Siberia?
No, but there's a dilettante. The landscape of the high Arctic is underlain by a kilometer of frozen ground. Now, in some cases, that frozen ground is saturated with water. In some cases, it's dry. But the ground under Siberia, under portions of Alaska, is below 0 degrees centigrade to a depth of 1 kilometer. And trapped in that frozen ground, there are fragments of previous organic activity, plant remains, animal remains, and the rest of it, which are slowly undergoing anaerobic breakdown. So they're not being converted into CO2 as they would be converted at the Earth's surface. They're being converted into methane. So methane is accumulating in these masses of frozen ground in the high Arctic on the European and the North American continent. And as the climate warms, we have documented very clearly that the margin of frozen ground retreats northward. And as ground thaws and the liquid in the solid ice in the ground turns back into liquid, methane escapes. And the methane is an effective greenhouse gas. It traps more outgoing infrared radiation than CO2 does by what's reported to be a factor of 23. But it also, since it's a highly reactive gas, it's converted to CO2 and water vapor in a very short time. So there is the prospect that large amounts of methane will be released to the atmosphere, oxidized to CO2, as the margins of the permafrost in North America and Eurasia migrate north. There's also an equivalent risk associated with the warming of the deep ocean floor, because in the sediments on the ocean floor under high pressure and very low temperatures, these molecules called methane hydrates or methane clathrates have accumulated. And as that bottom water warms, then these can be released and bubble up through the mass of water and appear at the surface as a new slug of greenhouse gases added to the atmosphere. One hypothesis for the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which we refer to as the PETM, which was some kind of an environmental crisis on the Earth's surface about 55 million years ago. Is that right, Yvette? 55 million? The PETM is thought to have been triggered by a burst, a bubble of methane from the deep ocean during a period of warming, which produced a feedback loop which made that warming that much more pronounced. Whether or not we're at risk of a similar catastrophic event in the near future is a topic worthy of some discussion. But that's the background, I think, of the effect that you're talking about.
That's a pretty good answer
Bob,
for a dilettante.
I'd say that was a wonderful illustration of why you are affectionately known as geek. I would just add cool geek.
Or warming geek.
Over there. In the middle, top, yes. And then we'll come down.
Hi there. I would call that a virtuoso response rather than dilettante. My question is sort of...
Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Thomas Ho. I'm a senior in the college. My question goes back to the definition of sustainability, and Professor Geigerbach sort of defined it as balancing the needs of the present versus the needs of the future. So if we think about... So I want to ask the professors about the possibility of focusing on the individual needs and individual persons, because everybody sort of has some idea of the present planning of him or herself and the future planning. And if we focus on the individual, and I think many individuals have this idea that we need to, as humans, need to preserve the planet, have this kind of I don't know if you call it moral or self-conscious, and focus and ask, and what we should do is possibly ask academia to try to develop this kind conscience among the students, among other people, among people even not students, to develop this conscience and use academia as a means to empower individuals with knowledge and the skills necessary to seek sustainability among his or her own life and what's beyond. And if we do this and if this happens on a grander scale across Penn and across all the universities, then we could possibly have a more global response of sustainability driven by individuals.
So you're basically asking, how can we motivate individuals to
As academia.
Right,
to motivate
right.
individuals.
I could take a crack. I could take a crack at that. I think that actually your question raises is a good one that highlights the difficulty of using a definition of sustainability. And sometimes there are problems with that. And the one that you focus on, and the one that was the original future generations focus, I think has some risks. Because it's very easy for people to say, well, you know, it's future generations, so let's not worry about it. And I think your question highlights the ability to answer a question, why do I care? Why should any individual care? And I think there are lots of different perspectives that one can take about that. One of them is a strictly economic perspective. I think there's a tendency to just think, well, every individual is on their own. You know, and it doesn't really, and if you start to have an understanding of why that doesn't work for many different kinds of environmental problems, the tragedy of the commons is a common teaching vehicle, I think is very powerful in this area, then you start to understand why this matters in a larger context, why does it ethically matter, why does it matter whether we have laws that address these kinds of issues, et cetera, and I think you get into the teaching lessons that you're looking for.
What can individual, I mean, another part of the, is what can students here and now do as individuals to make a difference? I mean, this is such a big problem that it would be easy to say it's everybody's problem, therefore it's nobody's problem, right? And certainly any individual can't make a huge difference to prevent the end of the world, you know, happening. So what, and yet individual students are interested, and I would certainly be interested along with them in your taking a stab at what should or can individual students do right here at Penn.
Well, the exercise I'm sorry.
Go ahead,
go
Jeannie.
ahead.
Jeannie
No.
Jeannie and Bill.
Go ahead.
Well, we just had a very interesting conference. I don't know if we were going to talk about that. And it was called Urban Design After Peak Oil. And one of the findings was it would be really wonderful if all of our students could figure out what their own ecological footprint was. And as they understood what their ecological footprint was, that might then raise their individual consciousnesses about how they were affecting the earth, and then take remedies to that. I don't know if that's very
No, I was going to go to.
I like that
I was going to go to an
concept of
almost
it.
identical but different example. Tuesday, first class meeting of
Okay.
my class.
Yeah.
No, it's the same spirit, but it tries to get at the other question, which is I ask everybody in the class to get their own or their parents' utility bills for the last year. Go to the EPA Energy Star home energy yardstick, and that rates their building against all others of their type. Meaning it does exactly the same consciousness raising, but I think I mean, these are small examples, but the bigger question that was asked is, how do we think about living within our means? So the first point, both these examples go to, well, I don't even know how much I use, so first I would have to understand that. The more challenging question is, then what are reasonable means? Because we live in a civilization which is living dramatically above the carrying capacity of the earth, defined just as the kind of product of photosynthesis, right? Huge amounts of energy being transformed all the time because of that storage of fossil fuels. Now, the question of how much should I save for future generations, it's not just a technical question, right? And it's not just a question of desire, it's a merger of the two of them. So that's why I would say those examples then go the next level.
And I actually did a
cities.
similar one where I was talking about water in one of my classes, and I asked the students, you know, how much water do you use in a day? Could they answer? No. Could I answer? No. At any rate,
But we should
if you
be
take a shower, how much water are you using?
And in a society
can
without
answer.
no, in a society without plumbing Everybody uses about a gallon a day. In our society, we use anywhere from 50 to 70, depending. Everybody in here, you didn't think you did, but
200.
200.
Yeah. I
That's
would
including
also
agriculture.
add that
Agriculture.
it's very,
200.
it's
domestic.
very important that individuals take leadership roles in committees like the Environmental Sustainability Advisory Committee, ESAC, which is advising the university on our institutional policies. And there it takes individuals coming together who have a real educated interest in this subject with experts, faculty members and administrators, to make significant recommendations to what we're going to do as a university when we build buildings, when we recycle, and when we consider partnering with the city on bicycle share, when we're trying to bring down the percentage of our faculty, staff, and students who drive cars as opposed to bicycling or walking to campus, taking public transportation. So that's an important way where individuals come together with institutions. Another question? Yes. Go ahead.
My name is Noah Apskar. I'm also a senior in the college. And I guess this question takes from the individual back sort of global or national in this case. And since we have a panel of such an interdisciplinary attack on this question, something that's bounced around The Economist, the New York Times, Newsweek, the potential for a quote-unquote Green New Deal. And what sort of your guys' estimation of how that might work, what your criticisms would be, what steps you might take or suggest or caution about in
So
taking
this,
these
in a
steps.
sense, is a recommendation to our new administration and
Sure.
to President Obama. Should he undertake a Green New Deal?
And if so, what that would look like.
Okay. Anyone want to take that? Bob? Jeannie?
Well,
Mass transit. Insulate houses.
I'm going to go. The reality is that we are using resources, energy, material resources, at rates vastly larger than they're being replenished by any process. I mean, what we're doing across the world is as far from so-called sustainability as you can imagine. We can start to reduce the amount of these resources that we use. They'll still be way in excess of the rate at which they're being replenished. So not only are we using them faster than they're being replenished, we're contaminating the stuff we're not using at a faster rate than we're using the resources that we take advantage of. So we are about as far from something elusively described as sustainability as you can imagine. But I take heart from just, I'll give you one example. In 1904, one of the Wright brothers, Wilbur, Orville, whoever he was, he flew his airplane 120 meters, right? 65 years later, Neil Armstrong put his foot on the moon. So I think if you build into the definition of a sustainable society the capacity of human inventiveness to come up with better ways to do the things that we're doing, then you open the possibility that human life as we know it could be sustained for generations into the future. So the things
Does that mean you want technology investments? Or
that means
you didn't
I
answer the
want
question,
Novocaine?
like-
Do you want
that means
Novocaine?
I want the people, you guys, the students, to focus their attention on careers in developing these alternatives.
Right.
And whatever
But
Barack Obama can do to encourage that, he gets my support.
How about Bill? What do you think, Bill, for
Well, no,
Green New
I
Deal?
mean,
A Green New
so
Deal.
yes, absolutely yes. I'm not the person to say how Obama should accomplish it or whether it comes through government investment or other form of incentive. But just the example for me within our field, the last 6 months prior to the previous 3 months, the amount of ingenuity, the amount of ideas, the amount of people stepping out of places you didn't know they were hiding with ideas or possibilities or business plans that they were ready to mobilize simply because the price of oil had hit such a high. And they were even betting, incorrectly, that it would only drop to whatever, 70, 80. So I think absolutely yes, and I think there's a huge amount, I've thought for 30 years, there's a huge amount of potential. I don't know what it will take to shift to an entirely sustainable economy, but I do believe that the beginning of that shift begins with exactly that kind of work.
And we shouldn't let the best be the enemy of the good. A Green New Deal or something the equivalent of that will be, speaking as a political scientist now, a key to Barack Obama keeping support for from young people in this country. Because there is the broadest base of support on this issue. And it's also a way of tackling energy independence of the United States from Middle Eastern oil supplies. It's a way of giving a boost to the economy with jobs for infrastructure, that is sustainable infrastructure. So whatever it's called, the content is on a track that is politically viable. He's got to get the details right, but it's going to be necessary to give the scholars who are interested in this area the support necessary to actually develop the energy alternatives, whether it be at the nanoscience and technology level or at the level of design. So I think something along these lines is critical politically to addressing the sustainability issue.
I think also the economic conditions actually are a huge opportunity, because we know that individuals and most corporations, they're not capable of planning for events that are outside their prior experience, like a decline in the real estate market. And what we have now is a situation where people are clamoring for money to be spent.
Yeah.
And just spend it. We're not, for a change, we're not worried about the immediate short-term return necessarily on what that spending is. And so this is a great opportunity to spend on something that would have a long-term return.
They're interested in one part of the short term, that it stimulates
That
the
it be
economy.
spent.
Right, and that it creates jobs and that
Jobs,
it creates
right.
some good for
This
the
is a
country.
great
And
chance to do
it is
that.
a great chance to do something that otherwise is much more difficult to do. We have many, many. Over here, yes. This young woman with the Penn. I can't, the Penn Engineering, how could I resist?
So we can
Go ahead, Penn Engineering. What's your name?
I'm Louisa. I'm a junior in chemical engineering. And my question was, I read Collapse by Jared Diamond, and I thought it was extremely inspiring even. And it talks a lot about the tragedy of the commons and how it's about the fishermen and how the fish run out because they all fish out of the same place. But my question really is that now there's more of a tragedy perhaps of the privatization of the commons, because water and fish and everything, it's not even that people can just fish at will and it'll run out because they're all fishing, but it's being privatized by companies and sold as a commodity. So I wanted to know the whole panel's opinion on that.
Well,
Mr. Wharton.
I guess
Eric, you're on.
I guess I
You're
brought
on.
up the tragedy of the commons in the
I
book.
was just looking because of the comment of Jared.
I think it's a great question, and I think you're right. There are a lot of debates. There are a lot of different ways once you appreciate that a specific problem, and many environmental problems you can analyze in terms of a tragedy of the commons. It becomes difficult depending on the different problem. And this is why it's a good idea to start with the different problems about what the right answer is to a particular problem. Sometimes in a tragedy of the commons situation, it's a good idea to have private property allocated. And actually, I think in the fisheries example, it's a very large problem and there are different kinds of fisheries, but sometimes that makes a lot of sense to privatize the total resource in some rational way, so you don't have just a lot of independent privatized fishing businesses who often get completely irrational subsidies from governments to be fishing out all the resources. So sometimes private property works. Sometimes I think you're right that that doesn't work, and you have to look at other solutions. Sometimes it's been thought that privatizing water in certain areas would work, and then the politics of a particular situation made it clear that that was not the right answer. So I think it's not very. It depends on the problem. Is the answer I would give to your question.
Over here, Afaf Melis, Dean Melis. We have several wonderful deans in the audience, and I always give my deans priority. So,
They don't give it to her. So part of this is about the global impact. And we reached this stage of thinking about sustainability of green and greenness after we have used and enjoyed lots of resources and lots of luxuries, and we got us to this point. Now this green movement is moving to the developing world too, and we are very critical of their industrialization and so forth. So those men who are barefooted and non-pregnant in the developing world are looking at us and saying, why?
Do they both have to? They have to be both barefoot and non-pregnant.
And non-pregnant.
Okay.
Unfortunate for them. They are the latter one, the non-pregnant one. Are saying, why don't you let us enjoy some of the luxuries and some of the resources? Why should we be deprived at this point as we are just beginning to enjoy some of that? So should we be saying to those people, and what should we be saying? Should we be saying something different for the developing world than the non-developing world or the developing world?
In other words, does the developing world get a pass because they have used up far less of the sustainable resources, the non-sustainable resources than the United States has?
Our primary responsibility is to provide them with the resources to elevate their people to the standard they choose in ways that we will find acceptable. If we're going to propose to tell them how to live, it's up to us to provide them with the resources they need to do that. At one of these recent economic summits, the Prime Minister of India, he pointed out that the average Indian produces 1/20 of the volume of greenhouse gases that the average American produces. And he said to the public, he said, I promise you, India will not rise to the standard of the United States. But it's an enormous disparity.
He didn't say how many more Indians there were, though, than the United States. But just to be, there's a bad argument on both sides. On both sides.
There's also
the argument on the U.S. side is, you know, we have a smaller population and we feed. It's partly your argument, Bob. We give all this aid to the other world. Terrible argument. Yeah. But the argument of the big developing countries like China and India is equally bad, and I'm using this in a non-moral, it's bad from the perspective of sustainability, which is we use far less per capita. They do use far less per capita.
There's just one
it's
interesting...
It's a great question. So how do we answer this?
Well, one interesting paper was, I forget the colleague's name at Princeton, but he's in the climate change area. Maybe someone else knows it.
Sokola?
No.
Wedge theory?
No, well, I'll tell you what it is, and then maybe some. But he basically studied. It's interesting that this debate is always in terms of countries, sort of politics. And one of the things that he pointed out was, if you really look at it just from an economic point of view, it's the wealthy people today are the ones who have had the benefit. And if you then look at where are all the wealthy people, it's true that a heck of a lot of them are in the United States, but there's a lot of people in the United States who are not very wealthy. And there are also people in developing countries, many of them making the decisions and giving the excuse that we don't have to do anything about this, who actually are fairly well off and better off than others. So I think that's an interesting different context of how do we think about this problem? Is it only countries as representatives of all the people who are in the country?
It's a fascinating way of cutting through what otherwise becomes a very unproductive political argument, because the people, by and large, who are benefiting are not defined by nationality, but by wealth.
I do think there's a leadership.
And we have to figure out a way of addressing what is a moral issue, which is the rights of people to basic, to the basic needs, no matter what kinds of arguments we have about needs at the high level.
But with
at the same time, just one sec, at the same time is figuring out how those of us who have more can contribute to the solution to the problem rather than the problem itself. Yes.
But with these people, our credibility is zero.
Yeah.
Because our exploitation is so extravagant.
Right.
I was going to say the leadership question is.
Yes.
But ours is the leadership of this country.
Ours is
right?
the leadership.
It's not the credibility of the small farmer, or it's the credibility of a country which is using resources at an unprecedented
Well, and our
rate.
country has status based on consumption,
Yeah,
and that's something that other people may aspire to, but if we could
Yeah.
find a way that you could consume efficiency and somehow make that something that people aspire to, I don't have the answer to that, but that would change the way
Yeah.
that we view
well, the
our own-
sustainability movement is an answer to that, and it has to be a movement, both domestically and worldwide.
But I think this touches on the leadership in what way. I mean, I think the question on that note is the answer for a wealthy country or a wealthy class is, in effect, to find ways to demonstrate what it is that is worth having. That is, sustainable is a word that gets us into trouble every time we use it, but I think the issue here isn't resources or energy, it's the power of display, it's the power to do things that are valued. So if one a slide I show every year is of a whole group of teenagers, I think they're graduating from a high school in Vermont, in the middle of the winter in a hot tub. And you look at it, it's fabulous. I mean, what could be more a more efficient way to dump energy into the environment than a big hot pool in the middle of Vermont?
Full of
And everybody,
teenagers.
oh my God, it's a luxury. What a waste of energy. And you say, oh, but this entire pond is solar heated. Now suddenly this is now somehow an environmental good we've provided. And it's easy. There's a very famous architect who often says, sustainability is about the worst measure we could have possibly come up with. How many people, when they say to you, so, how's your life turning out? I haven't seen you. Well, how's your marriage? Oh, my marriage, sustainable.
So what is the right term? What is the right term?
No, I actually think that
It's
this
better
is...
than unsustainable.
There's a word for that, too.
It's not the worst answer in the world.
Well, but I mean to point out that the efficiency and energy are not the measure by which we judge our own happiness. Right. It's the power to do the things that that give us time with people we care. All of those other goods.
I would say that the beginning of an answer to Dean Melissa's question, and I mean this seriously, is if the United States doesn't take the lead on this issue, we cannot expect any other country to do it. So that makes it all the more important for we here, and Penn as a university, to take the lead, because we have no standing in the world if we don't.
Right.
Well, and Penn is the wealthiest part of the United States, and that's
well,
why
we
have
the
to
Wharton
do it.
School.
Not design. We're creative.
But Bill, I think you've made a very important point as well in response to this excellent question, which is we have to make it sexy in some way, to put it, to use your marital metaphor.
Why else would anybody do it?
It can't just be it's got to be done in a way that we can do more than just sustain ourselves, but we can move forward. That we can move forward as an educational institution, as a research engine, and so on. So we've got to find really clever ways of doing this.
Golf is a game in which you try and get the lowest possible score, right? So
and you win.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but golf, Mark Twain said, is a good walk spoiled.
May not offer that.
Okay. We have so many questions.
This guy right here has his hand up for a long time.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to address a little bit, or have you address the ethical and philosophical question, which to a certain extent the dean raised. I'm a member of the
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, yes. My name is Charlie Coyne. I'm a graduate of the class of 1970 with a Bachelor of Science in Economics and Political Science from the Wharton School. And I'm today a lawyer, and I'm also an active alumnus. And also for 20 years I was in the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. I was a very good friend of Dr. McHarg's. Now, the ethical and
what are we saying?
So, which means I'm a member of the choir. And I don't mean that as a criticism. But there is an ethical and philosophical question here that you've been dancing around, but you really started with it. Sustainability, we've been talking in terms of the two extremes, a world that collapses, or a world that we manage to talk people into stopping all the bad things they're doing. What's really going to happen is going to be somewhere in the middle. And it could be a world where we preserve the wild, we preserve some segment of the agrarian society, which I personally and most Americans are very attached to. We make cities continue to exist as cities, but somehow make them work a little better. But basically preserve very much the society which we have come to know and love. Or there is a vision of the world that was very popular at the 1939 World's Fair, was even at the next World Fair in New York I was at as a boy, and where you have kind of a completely artificial environment, sustainable. But everything's under plastic tubes, and all your water is treated or comes out of somewhere, and you mine asteroids for additional resources, and you create this artificial, but sustainable, at least for according to Malthus, nothing is sustainable in the long term, but for 100, 200 years or whatever, we could create such a world. And that's an ethical decision, not unlike the ethical decision about the people in other worlds who want hot water or regular drinkable water and don't want to die from river blindness or go blind from river blindness. How do we resolve this ethical decision? What right do we have to tell anybody that our vision of the world is the right vision, the agrarian, wild preservation one?
Mm-hmm. Okay. What right do we have?
We've imposed our vision on Iraq. Why not here?
Well,
yes.
I guess I'll take one stab at this, and others may be better qualified. I think on ethics, you're absolutely right. I think that's the key question, and it comes up in terms of connecting up with other questions people ask about why do I care? Like why as a student should I take this path rather than some other path that is a defined path that doesn't have a conception of caring about the environment or sustainability or preservation of the wild. And I think that also goes up to institutional levels as well. So in my view, this is an issue that some business students should be considering when you're thinking about what kind of a business are you running, and what are the parameters for how you should think about the effects that your business operations have on the environment, or how you're marketing products, et cetera, and the other institutions as well. So without being able to answer your question very well, I can agree at least that it's a fundamental question that we should be engaged with.
So I don't see your question, as critical as opposed to just, and I think importantly, shedding light on the fact that every one of the issues we're discussing has an ethical dimension to it. And when we say, so the challenging way you pose the question is, what right do we have to impose our view on others? The answer, I think, is, first of all, we all have a right to our views. And therefore, if there are any basic rights, one has the right to speak one's mind. And this country at its best, stands for the right to speak one's mind. And that's all we're doing right now, is speaking our minds. But the more, to push it further, I think it's very important to recognize that whatever this country does as a matter of policy with regard to the environment, whatever the University of Pennsylvania as a private institution does as a matter of policy with regard to the environment, is not ethically neutral. It's ethically loaded. And there's no default position. Right. There's no escaping that. If we do nothing, we are subject to an ethical judgment about that. And if we do something, in the positive direction, we are. I think where you began is where I think is a very productive way to frame it, which is we should not put this as an all or nothing decision. We do not have the panacea to this problem, right. But that is not a reason to do nothing. Right. And I think it's really important to speak about the values and that's where we began, remember? Why is it important? It's important because sustaining the earth is important. It's important because it has distributive effects on how people can live a good life or not. And it's important in a way that I think is a very important part of human nature. And that is, almost every human being cares about his or her children, grandchildren, future lives. We care about our legacy, and that's what this is about. So it's a terrific, and there are many, many questions here. So let me and we'll make them quick and our answers quick so we can get through as many as possible. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Louisa, and I work with Sherry Adams over there. And my question is that we're always comparing the lifestyle of the United States with the lifestyle in developing countries. But what I feel we should be comparing is US lifestyle and European lifestyle, and ask ourselves how is it possible that the US and Europe have a similar level of wealth but very different energy consumptions, and how can we get the United States to a European level?
So how can be the United States? We're going to take one answer to one question.
Price.
Go ahead,
The
Jeannie.
price of oil. We've kept oil low. We don't tax it the way the Europeans do. The Europeans tax oil. It price controls behavior.
Yep, very short.
Single most important factor. Okay, over here. Yes, gentleman here.
My name is Frank Nussey. I'm with Organizational Dynamics. And I heard Al Gore speak a few months ago, and he was really very a little bit kind of down. I mean, like he was kind of depressed even. I mean, and what he said
That's what happens when you win the Nobel Prize. It's sort of like,
What's next?
well, what he said was that the crisis of global warming, peak oil, sustainability is really, as far as this audience here is concerned, and here in the United States, it's a crisis of democracy. And it's my belief that sustainability is a local issue. So it's about awareness, it's about what each person does and what they're aware of. So it does come down to this issue of what each of us are going to do, and about education. So with the University of Pennsylvania being such an important entity within this region, I'd like to know what more you are going to do and why we aren't having this meeting in the palestra filled.
Well, I invite you all to the palestra, and we can discuss this while Penn basketball wins the Ivy Championship this year. But seriously, there are many people in this room who are helping the University of Pennsylvania do more and more in this regard. And we take this to begin as a local issue. We have increased our energy, the consumption of our energy from wind as opposed to from less carbon-friendly, carbon-sustainable sources. We have ramped up, and you're welcome to sign the Recycle Mania pledge over here. We're ramping up recycling. We're increasing the use of better forms of transportation on campus. We have a whole series of things that we're in the process of doing. And ESAC, this group, is presenting to Ann Papageorge, our Vice President for Facilities and Real Estate, and then to me, a plan for us moving ahead in the university on every dimension of becoming more carbon friendly. So there's a lot we're doing, and I would just submit to you that as great as I think this symposium is, I don't think the next step is to meet in the palestra. I think the next step is to take some of the suggestions that have come out of this for teaching, for research, for public policy, and for Penn, and move them forward.
Just a quick, it'll be real quick. There's a new minor that's available, but students should know. I think we're relabeling it, so undergraduates in all three undergraduate schools can do that.
Four undergraduate schools.
I'm sorry, excuse me. Four.
Nursing was the first of off, not the last.
Four. I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
Nursing, engineering, Wharton Arts and Sciences.
There's a new joint degree program, MBA, Master of Environmental Studies program, and there are a number of other curriculum initiatives that are going on here. So I think we're moving forward on that level as well.
Over here, young man.
Hi, my name is Zach Bell. I'm a freshman in the college. A lot of people consider the modern food industry to be a major problem for sustainability. And people even suggest that the only way to really counter that is to have a completely decentralized food system focusing on local farms. I'm wondering if you personally on the panel would be willing to give up the luxuries of a modern food system, and if you think it's feasible that the public will ever accept that.
No.
I would just like to make one comment. It doesn't really answer your question, but that a lot of times we come to an idea that sounds like it's going to work out really well, like using paper bags instead of plastic, or food that's local, but that's not always the best answer. Usually you have to dig a little deeper to find out what is even the most sustainable thing.
It's not all or nothing. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we could take a lot of lessons from the cities that have started extremely successful green markets, where they have been able to bring the food into the cities from the local markets, from the local farming areas, and that has sustained those farms. But I don't think we could ever imagine being entirely locally fed. It's in between.
And I think in each case, you have to go through the detailed energy analysis to determine that actually the energy cost of producing your food locally is lower than the energy cost of producing it in California and transporting it across the country. It's not a no-brainer. And each one of these separate incidents requires careful analysis before you reach that conclusion. You should realize that at the present time, way less than 1% of the American population is employed in producing food. And at the turn of the century, it was 63%. So there's been and you would be very hard to get anything like that 63% back to work hoeing.
And we have no malnutrition, or we have limited malnutrition.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Lucia, and I am a senior communications major in environmental studies, as well as a staff member here at Penn. And my question is, you talked about sustainability as a movement, President Gutman, and for a movement much like Obama, a movement of people, a movement of ideas in somewhat of a general direction, a consensus. So my question to you is communications-based. What recommendations would each one of you make to the major outlets, news outlets, mainstream communication outlets? You know, so much of what we do in academia gets contorted and reshaped by the time it meets the populace through TV and radio and magazines, so newspapers. What recommendations would you make at the point where Penn is more sustainable and you can take those suggestions forward? How do we get that out to the people? How do we convince common America, regular America, my husband? You know, when I come home and tell him those BPHs are bad.
So how do we communicate out so we can scale up what we're doing? I mean, one answer that I gave earlier is what the World Economic Forum has been traditionally, is focused on economics, and economists have dominated. And now that economists have helped bring us an economic crisis, they're more than willing to share with the rest of us the possibility of helping them solve it. But seriously, the World Economic Forum is now, you know, has an interest in the issue of sustainability. We at Penn signed a commitment of American colleges and university presidents, and we're proud to be the first Ivy to sign it, and that got a lot of publicity. But we do, I guess you're asking for some sound bites of how we can speak to the media effectively to feed a movement.
Well, I would, without answering the question completely, you just gave an example. How do you convince your husband?
Yeah.
Obviously, different people respond to different kinds of persuasion. An economic or a price-based argument works fantastically with certain kinds of husbands. On the other hand, exactly.
I think you hit the nail on this head.
No, I don't have to say anymore. But Jared Diamond's book's been cited a number of times, and there are some positive examples in there in which, I forget which century, Japan pulled back from completely cutting down its forests. And that was both a political decision enforced with force, but it was equally one in which the image or idea of the forest became one that was, right, the population was persuaded that this was a value.
Yep.
Similarly in Santo Domingo, right, and so I don't think it's simply easy, right? Actually, I think it's fantastically difficult, but I think it does take both parts of that, right? A sound, not just economic, but underlying, shall we say, energy and resource argument, and equally to find simple ways in which the picture of the good life which is involved is then made evident.
Gary.
This is a small scale thing, but it's relevant to both the previous questions. What might be nice is I love factcheck.org, right? It would be nice if we could set up a factcheck.org where you could go and say, should I buy lamb that's local or should I buy lamb from New Zealand? And somebody has gone back.
That is a great idea.
You know, gone
that is
through
a
it.
great idea.
You can show it to your husband and say, see, that's what
So you could have sustainabilityfactcheck.org.
Yeah.
But the other thing that would be, I think we need to feel more respect for our audience when we explain the complexity of these questions to them. I think we need the opposite of sound bites. I think we have to make the fundamental assumption that the people to whom we speak are capable of understanding these systems in their intrinsic complexity, and then we can get them aboard and they'll start thinking about them the same way we do. I think the strategy to come up with sound bites to make it catchy is counterproductive, and it's been part of why we are where we are.
Good. I mean, to think that it can be reduced to a few sound bites is really to avoid the problem rather than solve it. Tom Friedman's book, by the way, Hot, Flat, and Crowded, is, as far as a simple layperson's book, is very good. But it's not in itself going to be, we're not going to be able just to have a few sound bites. And that's why we exist as a university. If we could, we wouldn't need to have the complexity that we have. At the same time, as you can see by the faculty here, we have to be willing to explain things in ways that aren't full of jargon. And I really commend all of you for not using jargon in your explanations. Okay, over here, and then I'll come to you.
Hi, my name is Sarah Doherty, and I'm a junior in bioengineering. And my question is, a lot of students here are interested in taking the kinds of classes that you teach that have some focus on sustainability. But what really gets a lot of us going is when we can take multiple classes in these areas and then they connect. So I wondered what you five and what Dr. Gutman can tell us to look forward to in terms of Penn's commitment to bringing these classes together in a way that doesn't come together in a center for research, that is a real tangible way of bringing together. I know we've talked about a minor. I'm part of the East Academic Committee and part of SKU, but this is something we constantly fight for. And in the meantime, I know you mentioned it's hard to come up with a discipline that is sustainable development. What encouragement can you give to the other professors here, or what advice about how to integrate sustainable development and sustainable development topics into their courses?
I think what you heard from Jeannie Birch is that it undersells the issue to expect it all to come together in a small cluster of courses. At the same time, you've heard from Bill and others that there are more courses being developed in a minor that exists. And so you're asking what more, how can we do even more? And I think the answer is going to be that we're going to have to continue to encourage, as the faculty are, more faculty to be offering courses in this area.
Or to integrate the material.
And integrate what exists.
I think it's helpful. I think students asking for these kinds of courses helpful. I think alumni who are going to the dean saying, what are you doing in these? There are lots of different kinds of points where if you raise more money to allow research for Penn to develop some of these areas, it's going to attract new faculty who are then going to be teaching these classes. So there's lots of different ways in which I think we can do that.
And maybe ESAC could suggest an incentive program where faculty might be given seminars so that they'd be able to explore these areas, have time to integrate into their material.
And incentives for faculty to integrate aspects of the issue into courses, because there are, in my field, political science or ethics and public policy, it would be important for students to face up to, and faculty to teach about the issue of the environment without expecting all the faculty to, create whole courses on the subject. We need both. We really need both. Yes, gentleman here. And then we have one more, and then I'm going to ask Larry Gladney to wrap up.
Hi, I'm Will Heyer. I'm a senior architecture major. I'm curious, Bill mentioned the idea that the luxuries of one generation become the needs of the next, and that seems to be happening at an ever-increasing pace. Is there any more immediate way to meet these sort of perceived needs in the future than just waiting for any sort of technological advancement? Maybe each person could answer like according to their field.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two things are connected, but obviously quite different. The one being what one experiences during growth, and I think David Orr likes to describe, David Orr, the famous environmentalist, likes to describe the fun he had driving his, V6 convertible down the highway at 70 miles an hour. I think he says there's a six-pack on the, so it's a whole picture of a world that doesn't exist anymore. But he said that's the picture of the world of ever-expanding possibility, ever-expanding luxury as we ride the upside of the peak oil curve. And he said it is already and it is going to be a very different picture going down, but we have to invent it. So I think the one is a kind of truism and an observation about human nature and so forth. But I think I hope my remarks weren't taken to mean that the things we can do and the efficiency and things, those are somewhere off way in the distant future. I literally take what I saw among colleagues and people I knew, literally starting sometime last spring, running through about the beginning of September. The astonishing eagerness, vitality, inventiveness. Frankly, my own wife, who is, obviously signed on for this years ago, herself has cut our electric consumption by something like 15%, and I do measure it every month, but like 15% over, literally by a whole series of just turning lights off, change of behavior. So I think there's a whole variety of answers that I'm sort of touching on, but I think it is absolutely immediate, absolutely the part of every discipline here, and something that, don't wait until the price goes up. Yeah. Let's invent it now.
And I would, we've focused a lot on what we're not doing as individuals and society, but I see a lot of people and institutions and societies increasingly doing more. I just got back from China, and we have a partnership at Penn with Tsinghua University in Beijing, and we have a center called the T.C. Chan Center, and they're developing environmentally sound building design. And the political leaders, as well as the academic leaders and the students I met with in China, really care a lot and really recognize how important it is for their society and the world that we figure out and we start building buildings that are environmentally sound. And that's what we're doing on our campus. Every new building that we're building at Penn is going to be built to LEED standards. And the Penn Park, the 14-acre Penn Park that we're building, while LEED doesn't certify landscape design, it's being built to the highest environmental standards. And I see that a lot now, that individuals really care to do that. So I think your question is, the answer is where there are more and more people who are moving in that direction. And we, I think, should encourage it. We can't force it, but we can encourage it.
And let me slip in just a 10-second, vote for your choice, because I think architects are natural environmentalists, but they're also natural systems thinkers in this sense.
Yes, and the same thing I would say for engineers as well. They're, I think,
city planners
and urban planners. Yes. Erwan.
I got my 10 seconds.
Down here.
Thank you. Erwan Michel Kerjean, one of Eric's colleagues at Wharton. I teach a course called Environmental Sustainability and Value Creation for Wharton MBAs, who I believe are amongst the best MBAs in the world. What is interesting here is that, I started teaching the course this week, and that's the overcapacity already, which means that there is a growing demand on these issues, from business side, that also fit in when we talk to companies. More and more companies start realizing that this is not just being a good citizen, that there is a huge business and a lot of money to make out of that. And to achieve that and to create new products and new services, not only in the US but worldwide, we'll need new type of young professionals. And I think that's great under your leadership, Amy, that this university is seen as one of the leading universities in the world doing good things, because for our students, what that means when they go on the market is that they're pretty way above in the curve in terms of having thought about this issue in a very creative way. My question, and then we have to wrap up. Always we talk about what should be done, what could be done. Can you give us a little bit of what you believe has been the major progress over the past 10 years? What type of big successes we should celebrate in that area? Because I think there are a lot of things we should celebrate.
Right.
Before
It's a great way of wrapping up, because if we can't point, this is the challenge, if we can't point to things that are positive, it leads back to the depressing mean of Al Gore, which probably didn't help him win the presidency, actually, to cast depression on things. One has to point to things that are positive. So what are some of the, just one, one.
One thing that's very encouraging technologically and sociologically is that a university president will walk and want to find the smallest car and find a hybrid car. I mean, could you have imagined 20 years ago?
Wouldn't have done it 10 years ago, it's true.
And that car is there and can be bought.
And by the way, I will say, and this is a biographical, since I didn't answer the biographical question, I did not become interested in environmental issues and sustainability until relatively recently. And it was by being educated in it. It didn't, I didn't grow up thinking about it. I grew up thinking about big questions of justice because, my father had escaped Nazi Germany and so on. I didn't think about some of the most basic things. And it was my education at Penn very early on when I realized what a great urban institution could do in this regard. And if you look at the progress that Penn has made over the last 5 years, I think it could be a model for lots of other institutions. And I have to thank the faculty and the students for the great support. And I have a terrific team, and Dan and Ann and David, everybody is not only on board, but I think we can all say we get a lot of satisfaction out of what we do. So, Jeannie?
I would say in the environmental area in the past, since 1968, the passage of clean air, clean water, all those kinds of pieces of legislation, we've been tremendously successful in cleaning up our environment.
Good. Eric?
Well, one example, I think, in the past 10 years is the ozone layer depletion problem. And that it's an example where science became relatively clear on it. There's still some uncertainties, but the businesses that were involved with that were identified. And essentially, you had a political system that the international ban was, you had substitutes that were created for those uses by the business community. And I think generally it's now thought to be a success story.
And incentives were put in place,
Correct.
Governmental incentives in the right direction. That is a great success story. Bill?
I would just cite, being disciplinary specific, again, the LEED standard that the President mentioned, which didn't exist 8 or 9 years ago. Now, university presidents cite it, state agencies cite it, clients of all kinds cite it, and I even have colleagues who never had an interest previously in environmental topics who now put it in their email signature that they are LEED certified professionals. So I take that as a tremendous change of tide, at least within my discipline.
And Bob, I would cite your course and the popularity of what you teach as a very important sign of the progress we're making.
But may I add one more?
You may.
We've known for a long time that the sun delivers to the Earth's surface something like 10,000 times as much energy as all of humanity uses in the same period of time. And it is clearly the source for energy resources for the long-term future. So I think one of the most important inventions of the last 10 years was the invention of conducting polymers, which is the future of photovoltaic conversion, by Alan McDiarmid of our chemistry department, for which he got the Nobel Prize in 2000. One of my favorite people.
So I want to just conclude my portion of this symposium by thanking our wonderful faculty panelists for a most stimulating discussion.
One voice that hasn't been in this room so far today has been the voice of industry. So I feel a need to applaud you. I'm Katie Hunt. I'm the Corporate Sustainability Director for Roman Haas. And I think one thing you also do, which you haven't mentioned, you've talked about interdisciplinary and cutting across the university and bringing together the students and faculty. But we also need to bridge industry, academia, and government, as you've spoken on today.
Hear, hear.
And in organizational dynamics, actually, those three are coming together. I think Ann Papa-George and I and Mark Allen Hughes, who's the sustainability director for the city of Philadelphia, will be speaking on a panel in one of his classes on systems thinking and sustainability. So I applaud you for bringing these diverse thoughts together, and I look forward to working with all of you to make this the most green city in the United States, and as Mayor Nutter said, in the world.
We'll toast to that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well, luckily, my remaining task for the symposium is both straightforward and personally very gratifying. And that's first to thank and acknowledge the enormous effort that goes into putting something like this together. It always seems really simple when you say in September, we're just going to get 5 faculty together and they're going to talk for a couple of hours. But in fact, there's a tremendous effort that goes on beyond what you see for just today in order to make this happen. So first, I have to begin with offering the gratitude of the Faculty Senate to our professors on the panel today, and Professors Giegengak, Bernstein, Bram, Birch, and Orts for agreeing to sign on to this, sight unseen, not knowing exactly how it was going to turn out, but sitting through the meetings and planning for this. And I'd like to ask the audience to join me in thanking them for their efforts today. Next, we heard early on in this discussion from Jeannie the importance of leadership in making sure that seeking sustainability is actually in and of itself sustainable. And so I have to, again, personally offer my thanks for the enthusiastic agreement of our president, President Gutman, who signed on to once again moderate. And I think you can see that it's an enormously tough job to get faculty to talk. But she succeeds in doing that, as she did last year. And again, the Faculty Senate is enormously grateful for your leadership on this issue. And finally, just to wrap up the thanks, I have to, of course, acknowledge the efforts of the other tri-chairs of the Senate, Harvey Rubin, who's the chair-elect coming in, and Sherry Adams, who's the current chair of the Faculty Senate. Someone who's not in the room right now is Sue White. Sue is the person who makes sure that, in fact, beyond the planning, something actually happens, from the design of the poster that you see behind you to making sure that we have the environmentally appropriate water sources for each of our speakers. And so I do want to offer a big round of applause to her for the effort of getting everything together. She's outside the door. Lifting in. There's Sue. Finally, let me say that this is the second year that we've used this auditorium in the nursing school. So I want to thank Dean Millay and the rest of the nursing faculty and students and staff for making sure that we had a nice, comfortable, and warm place to have a great discussion on such a cold day. And finally, to say to all of you that we'd like to thank the audience by having you go outside and have food in the lobby that's right outside of the auditorium. Thank you.
We done it.